Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about kind of one aspect of the delivery that's often misunderstood, and that is hip-shoulder separation. All right, but before we kind of get to that, let's talk about movement sequencing a little bit. All right, so throwing velocity is kind of created through precisely sequenced and timed movements that kind of make up the whole delivery. And what kind of happens is if these movements happen in the correct sequence and at the correct times, high velocity is likely to be achieved. So the timing and sequence of these movements is very important as energy is kind of transferred from the feet through the body into the hand and then eventually into the ball. And so what's going to kind of happen is each body segment is going to be accelerated after the previous segment reaches its peak velocity and is rapidly decelerated. And if this is done at the proper time and kind of happens after that piece has been kind of maximally decelerated, we're going to get energy building as we go through these movements. So if multiple segments are kind of moving at the same time or being accelerated at the same time, we're going to get kind of this less efficient kind of building and transfer of energy as we go through this process. And this is part of the reason that kind of hip-shoulder separation is seen as such an important piece of the delivery. Okay, so what is hip-shoulder separation? Hip-shoulder separation is the time difference between the hips or the pelvis kind of reaching their peak rotational velocity and the upper torso reaching its peak rotational velocity. So it's not just like a movement thing, it's a timing thing more than anything else, all right? And so what's gonna be kind of different from athlete to athlete is how different does this timing need to be in order for us to kind of maximally get a stretch and a rebound effect from this and to kind of take slack out of the system. So this is gonna be a little bit different from athlete to athlete, and we'll kind of talk about what that means. One of the biggest misconceptions about hip-shoulder separation is that more is automatically better in an absolute sense for every athlete. This is not the case. So as I kind of just said a second ago, it's going to be a matter of kind of slack versus stiffness and then length-tension relationships as well. And so let's talk about kind of slack versus stiffness first. This is a concept kind of across athletics, but basically what this means is if we think about if you had a rope attached to a truck and you were going to attempt to pull that truck, before you can kind of create any force going to move that truck at all, we have to get that rope kind of pulled tightly. The same is kind of true of the muscles and tendons and bones, right? Before we can actually get the muscles and tendons kind of pulling on the skeleton, we have to take the slack out of those muscles, all right? And so, it's gonna differ from athlete to athlete how far we need to go to kind of take the slack out of those things. And this is gonna be kind of the difference between our looser movers and our tighter movers. So length-tension relationships basically mean that there's kind of this optimal length, both at the sarcomere and kind of whole muscle level for muscles to produce force at. And there's kind of this happy medium between, very short and very long. If we get to either one of those extremes, what's going to happen is there's going to be kind of this descending force curve where these muscles can't produce as much force. And so if we go to this kind of really, really big counter rotation, kind of trying to create this huge kind of hip-shoulder separation, for example, we'll likely take a lot of those abdominal muscles, right, and some of those other muscles kind of across the torso out of their optimal lengths for them to be able to create force. And what that's going to mean is if these muscles can't kind of act isometrically and kind of maximize their force production there, we're not going to get that big stretch across that connective tissue, right? So the fascia, the tendons, things like that are really going to give us this big rebound effect where we're going to get this movement velocity that's going to be higher than what we could do volitionally, all right? So we don't want to go crazy, crazy far. We're looking to kind of get to that curb where that stretch kind of leads to that rebound effect and then no further than that. So what that's going to look like is going to be a little bit different for each athlete. And there's certain training things we can do to kind of change the length-tension relationship, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, but something we'll talk about in the future. Okay, so kind of to round this out, what are the big ideas related to kind of hip-shoulder separation? So what's basically happening is that timing difference between kind of the hips getting open into foot strike and that torso being delayed is creating this big stretch across those muscles, the tendons, and the fascia. And what that's going to do is give us this elastic energy that's being stored and then released as we get into that rotation, all right? And so what the research kind of tells us is that the difference between high and low velocity pitchers doesn't rely so much on kind of that hip rotation angular velocity, right? It's more about the upper torso. All right, and so what's kind of happening is these rotate at a similar velocity between kind of high and low velocity groups, but the upper torso rotates at a vastly different velocity between high and low velocity groups. And so if we can kind of create this optimal stretch, right, by creating that optimal timing difference, right, between kind of the hips and the shoulders, we can get this upper torso kind of rotating a little bit faster and then kind of therefore giving us a little bit higher output. All right, so kind of the important things to remember, this is going to be highly individual. We're not going to force this range of motion. All right, it's based on kind of all kinds of things, loose versus tight movers, right, length tension relationships, taking slack out of the system, all of these kinds of pieces. All right, and what we're really after is kind of getting that rebound effect. So more is not necessarily better in an absolute sense. We're looking for what's optimal for that individual athlete. All right, if you got questions, feel free to comment below or shoot us an email. Thanks again for watching. Look forward to seeing you soon.